More than 2,000 people are believed to have vanished in a stretch of ocean known as the Bermuda Triangle. Ships that never arrived, planes that stopped responding, crews that left no final message, only empty water where they were last seen. Those numbers are estimates. The real count may be higher, because not everyone who disappears is ever reported, and almost no one comes back. Flying through the Bermuda Triangle has often been compared to a gamble, not because it always goes wrong, but because when it does, it ends completely. No wreckage, no explanation, just silence. For decades, the pattern has remained the same. Enter the triangle, and you may never leave it. That is why this story matters. This is not a theory. It is not a second-hand account. It is not a legend passed down over time. This is the testimony of a pilot who flew into the Bermuda Triangle and made it out. He was experienced. He wasn't reckless. The aircraft was reliable. The weather report showed no danger. Nothing about the flight suggested risk. In fact, it was supposed to be routine, short, forgettable. But what happened in the air that day doesn't align with how storms behave. It doesn't match how instruments fail, and it doesn't fit how time is supposed to work. The pilot would later write down exactly what he saw, what he felt, and what his instruments recorded. Not to convince anyone, but to preserve the details while they were still clear in his mind. Because some experiences don't fade. They follow you. And what he described raises a question that still hasn't been answered. Because what this pilot described doesn't fit weather or coincidence. The pilot's name was Bruce Kernan. In December of 1970, he was just 23 years old, but already far from inexperienced. Flying wasn't a hobby for him. It was routine. He had logged hundreds of hours in the air and had grown up around aviation. Sitting beside him on this flight was his father, a veteran pilot with decades of experience, along with a trusted business associate. Between the three of them, there was no shortage of judgment or caution in the cockpit. They weren't on a risky mission. They weren't pushing limits. They were simply returning home. Earlier that day, the group had been on Andros Island in the Bahamas, surveying land for a possible business project. When their work was done, they prepared for the short flight back to Florida. It was a route they knew well, one they had flown many times before. The distance was modest, the flight time usually about an hour and a half. The aircraft itself offered no reason for concern. Bruce was flying a Beechcraft Bonanza A-36, an airplane known for its stability, reliability, and smooth handling. Even today, the Bonanza line is considered one of the safest and best-performing general aviation aircraft ever built. Bruce would later say that if he had been flying anything else that day, he might not have survived. Before departure, they checked the weather. Conditions were favorable. Clear skies along most of the route, with only isolated storms far from their flight path. No warnings, no red flags. At around 3 in the afternoon, they took off from Andros Town Airport. The plane climbed steadily. The ocean stretched out below them, calm and familiar. Everything felt normal, exactly as it had on countless flights before. There was no reason to be alert, no reason to worry, until something appeared where nothing should have been. About 10 minutes into the flight, as the plane continued its steady climb, Bruce noticed something ahead of them. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't trigger alarms. At first glance, it barely registered as a problem at all. Directly in their path, roughly 2 miles away, was a single cloud. It was oval in shape, bright white and smooth around the edges, almost sculpted. Unlike most clouds which stretch and drift with the wind, this one appeared fixed in place, hanging in the sky as if anchored. Bruce estimated it to be about 1.5 miles long and nearly 1,000 feet thick, with its top reaching an altitude of around 15,000 feet. To Bruce, it looked like a lenticular cloud. Lenticular clouds are unusual, but not dangerous. Pilots are trained to recognize them. They often form near mountains or areas of strong airflow, and unlike other clouds, they tend to remain stationary. If that was what this was, there was no reason to avoid it. The cloud appeared calm. No turbulence, no dark coloration, nothing that suggested a storm. But there was one problem. Lenticular clouds are normally found at high altitudes, often between 20 and 40,000 feet. They don't form low in the sky, especially not over open ocean. Seeing one at this altitude was already out of place. Bruce noticed the inconsistency. He registered it, but he didn't panic. He checked the radio and listened to the latest weather updates. The forecast remained unchanged. Clear skies between Andros Island and the Florida coast, with only scattered, isolated thunderstorms far from their route. Nothing that matched what they were seeing. The cloud still looked harmless. It wasn't growing. It wasn't moving toward them. It wasn't showing any of the warning signs pilots are trained to avoid. So Bruce made a decision that, under normal circumstances, would have been reasonable. He continued on course. The plane passed through the cloud without incident. No turbulence, no sudden changes. They emerged on the other side exactly as expected. The moment passed, and Bruce mentally filed it away as one of those strange but explainable quirks of the atmosphere. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than that. That assumption would follow them for the rest of the flight. For a brief moment after passing through the cloud, everything returned to normal. Clear sky, stable instruments. The plane continued climbing toward its planned cruising altitude. It would have been easy to dismiss what they'd just seen and move on. Then Bruce looked back. The cloud they had just flown through was no longer behind them, as it should have been. It was below them, and it was changing. What had once looked like a thin, stationary formation was now expanding rapidly, swelling into a massive, billowing shape. Even more unsettling was the way it was rising. As the plane climbed at nearly 1,000 feet per minute, the cloud beneath them rose at the same pace, keeping its distance, as if locked onto their altitude. At first, Bruce assumed it was coincidence. Clouds build, weather shifts. But the longer he watched, the harder it was to explain. They climbed higher. The cloud followed. They increased altitude again. It rose with them. Then it caught them. Without warning, the plane was swallowed by the cloud from below. Visibility dropped to less than 100 feet. The cockpit dimmed. The air felt heavier. After about 30 seconds, they broke free, emerging once again into clear sky. Relief was brief. The cloud was still there, still climbing, still matching their ascent. Bruce tried again, pushing higher. Once more, the cloud enveloped the aircraft, and once more, they escaped. This cycle repeated itself several times. Each time, the cloud closed in faster. Each time, the window of clear air grew shorter. No one raised their voice. No one panicked. But the mood in the cockpit shifted. Bruce's father and their companion exchanged concerned looks. This wasn't how weather behaved. Clouds didn't chase aircraft. They didn't climb in perfect sync. They didn't surround planes again and again, as if correcting for escape. Bruce tried to reason through it. He checked the instruments. He adjusted their climb rate. He searched for a clear path away from the formation. Nothing worked. Eventually, they managed to pull ahead of the cloud once more, and for a few minutes, the sky ahead looked calm. The ocean below stretched out peacefully. It felt like they might finally be leaving the disturbance behind. Then they saw what was waiting in front of them. Another cloud, larger, higher, and forming directly in their path. At that moment, every safe option disappeared. As the second cloud continued to take shape ahead of them, Bruce slowed the plane and studied it carefully. This one wasn't like the first. It wasn't thin or isolated. It towered upward, stretching far beyond their altitude, its upper reaches disappearing into the sky. The formation curved inward, almost like two massive arms extending toward them. Bruce and his father began running through their options. Going above the cloud wasn't possible. It was already rising toward 40,000 feet, well beyond the limits of their aircraft. Trying to climb higher would be dangerous and futile. Going underneath wasn't an option either. The cloud appeared to extend all the way down to the ocean's surface, as if it were anchored there. There was no clear opening beneath it, no visible path through. Turning around seemed logical at first, but it came with its own risks. They had already spent time climbing and maneuvering. Fuel wasn't infinite. A long detour could push them dangerously close to their limits, especially if the weather continued to shift. Going around the cloud was just as problematic. Its width was enormous. Skirting the edge would mean flying far off course, adding significant distance to a flight that was supposed to be short and straightforward. If the cloud continued to grow, and there was no reason to believe it wouldn't, they could end up trapped with even fewer options. Every standard solution was blocked. That left only one choice: against instinct, against training, against everything pilots are taught to do when faced with a developing storm. Bruce pointed the plane toward the cloud. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, made under pressure, with limited information and no good alternatives. The cloud's outer edge still appeared white and soft, similar to the one they had already passed through. If they could cut through it quickly, they might escape whatever unstable air was forming around them. The moment the aircraft crossed the boundary, Bruce knew something was wrong. The light vanished almost instantly, as if night had fallen without warning. The bright white exterior gave way to darkness so complete, it felt unnatural. The cockpit instruments glowed sharply against the blackness, and flashes of brilliant white light began to pulse around them. Random, intense, and blinding. This wasn't a typical storm. This wasn't weather behaving badly. They had entered something else. The outside was white. The inside was something else entirely. The darkness inside the cloud wasn't gradual. It didn't creep in or thicken over time. It arrived all at once, as if the world outside the cockpit had been switched off. There was no horizon, no sense of direction, just blackness pressing in from every side. Then came the light. Bright, blinding flashes erupted around the aircraft, filling the cloud with sudden bursts of white illumination. They weren't bolts of lightning. There was no thunder, no visible strike. The flashes appeared and vanished at random, lighting up the interior of the cloud in a chaotic, stuttering rhythm. Each burst revealed swirling walls of vapor closing in around them before plunging the plane back into darkness. The deeper they flew, the worse it became. Bruce felt the aircraft being lifted and dropped by unseen forces, caught in shifting updrafts that came without warning. Visibility shrank to almost nothing. The windows showed only moving gray and black shapes, close enough to feel suffocating. It was as if the cloud itself had mass, thick, heavy and confining. Minutes passed, then more minutes. They weren't breaking through. Instead of thinning, the cloud seemed to stretch endlessly around them. Bruce later described the formation as resembling a massive ring, a donut-shaped storm with a hollow center that refused to reveal itself. No matter how far they flew, the walls remained. The interior felt sealed, like a billowing prison made of vapor and electricity. The pressure inside the cockpit was no longer just physical. Bruce's father sat rigid, eyes locked on the instruments. Their companion remained silent, gripping his seat. No one spoke much. Every pilot knows that storms can be dangerous, but storms have rules. They have boundaries. They don't behave with intent. This one felt different. Bruce estimated that they had flown nearly 10 miles inside the cloud. 10 miles with no exit. 10 miles with no clear sense of speed or position. The flashes continued. The darkness pressed in. The instruments offered little reassurance. Time began to feel distorted. Seconds stretched. Decisions felt heavier. The constant uncertainty wore on them, replacing fear with something more unsettling. A growing sense that they weren't moving through the storm at all. Then Bruce noticed something ahead. A subtle thinning in the darkness. A shift in the texture of the cloud. The chaotic flashes began to align, revealing structure instead of randomness. The vapor ahead appeared to part, forming a shape that didn't belong inside a storm. It wasn't a gap, it was an opening, and it was forming where storms don't open. Then, something opened where storms don't open. As the plane moved toward the opening, the cloud walls began to reshape themselves. What had been a chaotic mass of vapor now appeared organized, almost deliberate. Two towering anvil-shaped formations curved inward from either side, connecting above and below to form a long, cylindrical passage. It looked less like a break in the storm and more like a tunnel carved directly through it. Bruce estimated the opening to be nearly a mile wide, stretching 10 to 15 miles ahead of them. At its center, the passage seemed unnaturally smooth, with the cloud walls forming a clean, rounded corridor. At the far end, visible even from a distance, was something they hadn't seen in a long time, a patch of bright blue sky. With no other options left, Bruce turned the aircraft 90 degrees to align with the tunnel and flew straight into it. Almost immediately, he felt his body lift against the seatbelt. The sensation was unmistakable. Weightlessness. For a brief moment, gravity seemed to disappear. Bruce later said it felt as though he could rise out of his seat if not for the belt holding him down. It was a feeling he had never experienced before, not in decades of flying, and not even during steep climbs or turbulence. At the same time, the plane felt as though it was skimming across an invisible surface, hydroplaning through the air. As they continued forward, Bruce noticed thin streams of vapor forming at the tips of the wings. They stretched backward in perfect parallel lines, unlike anything he had seen during normal flight. The aircraft also seemed to be accelerating, even though he hadn't increased power. The tunnel walls glowed softly, lit by diffuse light that reflected off the smooth interior of the cloud. There was no turbulence, no shaking, just steady, silent movement through a space that felt engineered rather than natural. After roughly 10 seconds, the weightless sensation faded. The plane Behind them, the tunnel walls were closing. The circular opening twisted slowly, narrowing into a rotating slit as the cloud reformed itself. The passage they had just flown through was sealing shut, as if it had never existed at all. Ahead of them, the blue sky grew closer. They emerged from the tunnel in a single smooth motion, leaving the storm behind as abruptly as they had entered it. But the relief was short-lived, because when they looked around, nothing matched what they expected to see. When they emerged, nothing was where it should have been. On the far side of the tunnel, the sky was no longer blue. It had shifted to a dull grayish white, washed out and unfamiliar. A strange haze surrounded the aircraft, thicker than normal mist, yet somehow clearer. Despite the fog-like appearance, visibility stretched far into the distance, far more than it should have under those conditions. Bruce reached for the instruments. That's when he realized something was very wrong. The magnetic compass was no longer steady. It was rotating slowly, drifting counterclockwise, as if the plane were turning, though it wasn't. Other navigational instruments showed conflicting readings, offering no reliable sense of heading or position. Systems that should have agreed with one another no longer did. Even the more advanced electronic aids weren't behaving normally. Bruce asked his father to check their position. He was meticulous with charts and instruments, but this time he took longer than usual. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a strain that hadn't been there before. Something didn't add up. They didn't know where they were. With every standard reference failing, Bruce focused on what he still had: time and basic math. He slowed the aircraft to a safe maneuvering speed, giving himself room to react if needed. Using their flight duration and estimated speed, he began calculating their approximate position, constructing an imaginary compass based on true north rather than magnetic readings. It wasn't precise. It couldn't be, but it was better than flying blind. By their calculations, they should have been southwest of Miami, still several minutes away from land. If everything worked as expected, they might cross the Bimini Islands in 6 or 7 minutes, or they might be nowhere near them at all. The haze continued to thin as they flew, but the sense of disorientation grew stronger. Nothing outside the windows offered familiar reference points. The ocean below looked endless and uniform, stripped of depth and scale. Bruce picked up the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control. He explained that he was unsure of his position and requested assistance. The controller paused. Then came a response that made no sense. They couldn't see his plane on radar. Not between Andros, not between Bimini, not anywhere along the route they should have been flying. Bruce listened in silence, because what the controller said next was even more unsettling. Then air traffic control said something impossible. Before Bruce could respond, the radio crackled again. This time, the air traffic controller sounded confused, and then suddenly urgent. A moment earlier, there had been nothing on the screen. Now, a single aircraft had appeared. The controller reported seeing a plane traveling west, directly over Miami Beach. Bruce checked his watch. They had been in the air for just over 30 minutes. That wasn't possible. Under normal conditions, the flight from Andros Island to Florida took around 90 minutes. Even with favorable winds, it couldn't be done in nearly half that time. Bruce considered the possibility that the controller was seeing another aircraft. He said nothing at first, waiting for confirmation. Then the haze began to break apart. Thin ribbons of mist peeled away from the windshield, dissolving into clear air. the grey light faded, replaced by bright daylight. As their eyes adjusted, the familiar outline of the Florida coastline came into view. Below them was Miami Beach. There was no doubt about it. The buildings, the shoreline, the grid of streets, they were exactly where the controller said they were. Bruce looked back at the instruments again, hoping for some explanation. There was none. The compass still hadn't settled properly. Their calculations still didn't align with the distance they should have traveled. The time simply didn't match the location. Yet there they were. Bruce's father confirmed it visually, matching landmarks against the chart. Their companion leaned forward, scanning the coastline in disbelief. None of them spoke for several seconds. The impossible had already happened. They continued the remainder of the flight in silence, guided now by familiar airspace and functioning communications. When they finally landed, the aircraft showed no signs of damage, no evidence of the violence they had flown through. On paper, it was an uneventful arrival, but nothing about it made sense. The plane had arrived too soon, too far, from a place it shouldn't have been able to escape so quickly. The flight was over. The questions were just beginning. As extraordinary as Bruce's experience was, it didn't exist in isolation. When his account is placed alongside others recorded over centuries, a pattern begins to emerge, one that repeats the same disturbances long before modern aircraft or navigation systems ever existed. One of the earliest written references comes from Christopher Columbus himself. During his voyage across the Atlantic at the end of the 15th century, Columbus noted strange occurrences in his ship's log while passing through the same general region. He wrote of a brilliant light appearing in the distance, descending suddenly into the ocean. He also recorded unexplained compass deviations, his instruments failing to point in the expected direction, forcing him to rely on dead reckoning to maintain course. At the time, there was no language to explain what he had seen, no understanding of electromagnetic interference, no modern weather science. And yet, the symptoms were strikingly familiar. Over the years, sailors passing through the area reported compasses spinning without cause, sudden mists that distorted visibility, and lights appearing where no storms were present. Pilots later described similar issues: erratic instruments, strange atmospheric glow, and disorientation that didn't align with known conditions. What connects these accounts isn't the technology involved. It's the consistency of the effects. In many cases, witnesses described a sudden transition, clear conditions giving way to haze or fog that behaved unlike normal weather. Some reported bursts of light without thunder. Others spoke of lost time, arriving far earlier or later than expected, with no mechanical explanation. Bruce's experience echoed these details almost precisely. Different era, different vehicle, same symptoms. Each account, taken on its own, could be dismissed as coincidence or error. But when viewed together, they suggest that whatever affects the region does so independently of human tools. It doesn't target ships or planes. It disrupts navigation. It alters perception. And it leaves behind the same unanswered questions. Different centuries, same disturbances. Over the years, scientists have proposed several explanations for the unusual events reported in the Bermuda Triangle. Some of them account for individual elements of what pilots and sailors have experienced. None of them explain everything. One commonly cited factor is magnetic variation. The Earth's magnetic field isn't uniform, and in certain regions, the difference between magnetic north and true north can be significant. Before modern GPS systems, this discrepancy could easily lead to navigation errors, especially for pilots and mariners relying heavily on compasses. The waters around Bermuda contain large deposits of magnetite-rich limestone, which can interfere with magnetic readings and cause compasses to behave unpredictably. That could explain why instruments sometimes spin or drift. Another theory involves methane hydrates, large deposits of natural gas trapped beneath the ocean floor. In laboratory conditions, sudden releases of methane bubbles can reduce water density enough to cause ships to lose buoyancy and sink rapidly. In theory, such releases could account for the disappearance of vessels without leaving much wreckage. Environmental factors also play a role. The region is known for rapidly forming storms, powerful updrafts, and unpredictable weather systems. Certain cloud formations can appear suddenly and grow with surprising speed, creating dangerous flying conditions if misjudged. But these explanations stop short. Magnetic interference doesn't account for structured tunnels forming inside storms. Methane hydrates don't explain aerial weightlessness or acceleration. Weather patterns, no matter how severe, don't create corridors with smooth walls or cause aircraft to travel vast distances in implausibly short times. Each theory explains a fragment of the experience, but not the experience as a whole. That doesn't mean science is wrong. It means it may be incomplete. Bruce's account doesn't demand belief. It simply presents details that don't fit neatly into existing models. And when multiple explanations are required to explain a single event, it raises a deeper question about what we're still missing. Explaining parts doesn't explain the whole. Bruce Jernan never claimed to understand what happened to him. He never tried to turn his experience into a warning or a theory. He simply recorded what he saw, what he felt, and what his instruments showed on a flight that should have been ordinary. That's what makes his account difficult to dismiss. There was no benefit in exaggeration, no audience waiting at the time, no reason to invent details that could be challenged by physics, aviation experts, or simple math. And yet, when his experience is laid out step by step, the pieces don't fit into a clean explanation. Something altered the behavior of the storm, something interfered with navigation, something affected time, or at least the perception of it. Science can explain parts of the story, but not all of it. And until it can, the event remains unresolved, not as a mystery built on belief, but as a record of facts that refuse to align. The Bermuda Triangle doesn't need legends to remain unsettling. Real people have flown through it. Real instruments have failed there. Real journeys have ended too early, too late, or not at all. Bruce survived. That alone sets his story apart. Not because it proves anything, but because it reminds us that unexplained experiences don't require acceptance to deserve attention. They exist whether we're comfortable with them or not. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part. Some questions don't disappear when the journey ends. They follow you home. They linger long after the runway is in sight. Some places don't need to take you forever to change everything.